Charlie Larson, thanks for joining us. How are you doing tonight?
I am doing well. Thank you for having me on here. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to chatting with you both.
Yeah, us too. Yeah, when I saw your book, and because we both been to Egypt now, and we talk about all kinds of stuff, magic and all that, and I thought, let's it's time to kind of talk to somebody about this type of thing. Like your book is called Anubis, or did I pronounce that wrong?
It really depends on who you're talking to. Anubis.
Anubis. Darren already corrected me once. This is the problem with listening to something in a PDF reader. It gives me like the computerized voice, right? Ancient
Yeah.
Egypt's Lord of Death and Protection. So I thought, well, let's dig into this a little bit. So yeah, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you again for having me. It's funny. I actually have not been to Egypt, ironically enough, and that's one thing that's kind of in the works, I guess. I am planning-ish a trip at some
Cool.
point. So, yeah. Um,
It's pretty cool.
yeah. Yeah. There's a number of places that I definitely want to go, but um, yeah, I guess I will just kind of briefly talk about who I am. But my name is Charlie Larson, obviously. I am the author of the book. It just came out not yesterday, but the Monday before, last
Oh, cool.
Monday, the 4th. So it's only been out for a little over a week. But it's a sort of a passion project of mine. I've worked with Anubis for I don't even know. I've lost track, 2.5 decades or so. And this has been a project that I've been working on for a number of years, and a lot of complications kind of made me come back to it and then set it aside for quite a while. And eventually, obviously, came back to it and decided to do it. And so it's been a journey. It's definitely been a journey.
How long did it take since you decided to come back to it?
Let me see. I have sort of lost track of time because on the one hand, it seems like it's been forever. On the other hand, it feels like it's been a whirlwind ride. But I think I formally submitted everything and finished it last year in 2023. So it's been over a year, well over a year, actually.
Yeah.
But I've worked on it probably for a good 6 or 7 years, which sounds like a long time, but I've been, I guess, social media has its benefits and drawbacks, but one thing that I guess is kind of good is that you can connect with people kind of all over the world in ways that you may never have before. And so I've been a part of a few online communities where I've had the opportunity to write and teach over the years. And uh, that was one way that I sort of got started with it, because I had a lot of people that were asking me questions about Anubis and saying, you really should write a book about this. This is something that there's a lot of interest in, and um, you have a lot of knowledge to share. And so I thought about it, I started it, and right about that time, I went to a sort of, I guess, convention or conference for pagans and witches, sort of, and went to this joint session between the editors at Weiser and Llewellyn, and they gave a joint presentation on here's how to write a book if you're interested in this field. And so I went to that. I got kind of excited about it, and had a chance to talk to both of them. And they said, you have kind of a good idea here, and why don't you work on it and come back to us? And so I did. I worked on it. I probably got about halfway through it. And here's one thing about me is I have a lot of thoughts in my head, good and bad, just kind of a lot of self-doubt hit me really hard. And so I put it aside for a number of years. And then, like I said, it was 2023, probably, maybe earlier than that, when I finally decided, you know what, I'm going to do this. And part of it was Well, I think a large part of it was kind of a pact that I had made with Anubis, saying that I'm going to do this one way or the other. Even if nobody wants to pick it up and publish it, I will publish it myself. So, it was sort of in dedication to Anubis in a way. But
Well, and like you said in the book, I mean, there's not a lot of specific books going deep about him in general, right?
yeah, there are a lot of books about, well, from kind of a historical perspective, there's a ton of books about ancient Egypt, not necessarily about Anubis, but just about ancient Egypt in general. There are actually quite a few books on kind of Egyptian paganism, Egyptian magic,
Yeah.
Egyptian spiritualism, things
Yeah.
like that, but it's always kind of a broader perspective, or it talks about many gods of the pantheon, which is obviously also important, but there are a few, but there are not a lot of well-known books out there at the moment about specifically Anubis. So
I think it's an interesting topic, because we need to talk about the afterlife a little bit, or I mean, it is really coming out, like people are, I think, accepting it a little bit more. Like maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there seemed to be a bit of a battle about, materialism and this and that. But I mean, this being such an older deity as well, I guess, from the Book of the Dead, I guess it goes back quite a ways, and just the work they were putting into protecting people through the afterlife. I mean, it really, to me, it brings context to the whole thing, that like the ancient cultures have known about this and been dealing with it for so long. I think I think it will help us just become, able to accept that something else is going on here. It's not just, we're not just gonna, just
right. Yeah, and at least where I live here in the United States, it's historically death has been kind of a taboo subject. I think that's changing. I've seen over the last few years, maybe longer than that, I lose track of time, but this shift in perspective, I think people are beginning to, like you said, that there's so much more to this than meets the eye. And I think people's perspectives on it might be changing a little bit slowly. It's still an uncomfortable topic, obviously, but I think, I don't know, I can't say that I can pinpoint where that comes from, but there's just you look at cultures around the world, and there's just a wealth of fascinating practices and historical information out there about death practices. And so I think there's so much to learn out there, even just beyond your own beliefs and culture.
Yeah. Let's start by learning who Anubis is, because some people might not even know who we're talking about here, or
Great question.
Why it would be worth writing a book about him. But the thing is, as soon as everyone's seen like a picture of him, they'd be like, hey, I know that guy.
That's exactly right, though, because I think people recognize him even if they don't know who he is, because you watch a documentary on Egypt, kind of a general documentary on Egypt, and you're going to get so you're going to get popular images, symbols, and things, and I think people recognize this deity who has the sort of this canid-headed thing. I use canid because a lot of people will say jackal. He's got the head of a jackal, but I don't want to. I don't know. There's debate on whether it's a jackal or Ethiopian wolf or something, but so I use canid. But anyway, a lot of people recognize who he is, and for those who don't know, so Anubis was a deity in ancient Egypt who, thousands of years old, one of the oldest deities in ancient Egypt, and he started as sort of the Lord of Death, the Lord of the dead in ancient Egypt. There's so much to say that I don't even know where to begin about it, but very complex fellow. He's not just the god of the dead, but over time, obviously things shift. You talk about ancient Egypt, and what we consider ancient Egypt is actually spanning thousands of years, and within that thousands of years, you have so many changes of leadership, of cultural values and beliefs, and you have historical changes, and so beliefs in the gods and how they were viewed changed a lot, and so over time, Anubis's role shifted a little bit. There's are myths that talk about Osiris, who was originally this god of sort of civilization and agriculture, and through his death and rebirth, he ascended to Lord of the Dead. And Anubis was kind of seen by the people as more of someone who was in charge of, I guess, embalming and mummification. He assisted in Osiris's resurrection. But yeah, anyway, the point is that he's an incredibly complex fellow. There's a lot that people don't know about him. If you dig a little deeper, you find that over time, especially as you blend Egyptian history with the Greeks and the Romans, you find that he was invoked in a lot of magical practices, a lot of spell work. That he had a necromantic cult following in Rome, or the area near Rome, for quite a long time, until that was
squashed by the
exactly.
Maybe. So when was that? Was that back towards the end of the Egyptian dynasties, like in the early BCEs, kind of?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, early BCEs, or even maybe beyond that.
Okay. Because
Yeah.
I always hear this timeline reference that blows me away. Cleopatra to even just from a mainstream perspective, like from Cleopatra to the pyramids is way longer than from Cleopatra to now.
Yeah, the pyramids were already, like, I don't know, 2,000, 2,500 years old or something like that before Cleopatra was even thought of.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's just for perspective, because I think and I was always kind of guilty of this too before I started really digging into Egypt, is that you look at ancient Egypt as like one thing, and it was sort of unanimous and always that thing. But yeah, so much changed.
So what else is he? What else how would you else describe Anubis as? The embalmer, like, so helping people go into the afterlife, like basically like the Lord of Death, like you said, protector of that realm, kind of thing. And what are some other attributes that he changed into through cultural shifts?
Yeah. So people would pray to Anubis for protection, in a kind of a number of ways, protecting them in life, but praying for protection in the afterlife. There was a lot of thought. I mean, there's more to Egypt than just death. I think that's what all that's left are, a lot of what's left is these tombs and artifacts and things. So a lot of what we think of is related to death, but there is far much more to Egypt than death. But it was a very important aspect of their lives, and something that they put a lot of thought into. And so they would spend a lot of time preparing for that. And so Anubis was petitioned for protection for themselves, maybe for loved ones who were already departed, because it was seen as, in the afterlife, once you died, you went on a journey, a very long journey in the afterlife, that sort of ended at this point of judgment. And so throughout that journey, Anubis was their protector and their guide. And so obviously protection and guardianship is one aspect of Anubis. Then once they reached that but they reached that point of judgment, Anubis presided in what they called the weighing of the heart ceremony, which is where you would take the person's heart, representing their soul, and weigh it against the feather of Maat. Now, Maat was a goddess and also, a personification of she was a goddess and also just a concept of truth, order, justice, balance, that kind of thing. And so the idea was that if your heart was lighter than the feather, you lived a, I guess, virtuous life, whatever that meant. And you could continue on into the afterlife. And if your heart was found to be heavier and more dense than the feather, and you lived, I guess, what was deemed as maybe not such a great life, then your soul would be fed to Amit, who was I guess, this sort of dark I guess if you want to use the word evil, deity. I don't like using the word evil, but this dark deity of looking at the portrayal was this mixture of like the most feared animals in Egypt at that time. So like it was part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile. I only recently kind of thought about that, is that they were some of the most dangerous creatures in Egypt, and so it's like that your soul was fed to this creature, and you just ceased to exist. And so Anubis was not the one who made that final judgment. He wasn't the one who made the call, but he was the one who presided over the ceremony and would assist in that process.
Interesting. So we put out on audiobook the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and it's funny because after reading your book, I was looking at if I kept any notes on that narration, and I kept a note. I was trying to figure out what it was, but it was all the questions that are asked of in Matt, right? Like, and then I was flipping through your book and I noticed you had the 42 of them listed as well. So it's almost like before the commandments, right? It's almost like an earlier version of the commandments, like, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if you read them, it's kind of from a more broader perspective. It's not too dissimilar from that, I suppose. But and what I have in the book is obviously kind of a more simplified version, because if you read the original, it's kind of really complex, because there were 42 truths that you were to utter upon your death before your judgment, and each of those truths was a statement of, I did not do X, Y, and Z, or like I did not commit murder. I did not steal someone else's cow. I did whatever it might be. I don't know. I don't know if that's one of them. I don't remember. But anyway,
I have not driven the cattle from their pastures.
That's right. There was something about a cow I remember. But each one, and if you read it in as it originally is, it's kind of muddy and complex, because each one invokes a particular deity or spirit, and then you are saying to that entity, I have not done whatever. But if you take a step back, kind of the watered down version that I have in the book is, it's kind of just living I don't know, truthful, honest life, I guess, is what it comes down to. So.
Yeah, it seems to be very similar to, like, you don't harm people. You're kind of honest and truthful. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
So have you ever thought about the I don't know if I want to go to this other question yet, but Darren, do you have any other questions about Anubis or anything else?
Who's Anubis?
Or Anubis?
Well, is there any? You talked about the timeline of Egypt, which I would argue goes back even further than thousands of years, to maybe into tens of thousands of years. Is there any evidence for Anubis in the oldest dynasties? The real neat stuff.
Everything I find in historical record kind of points Anubis, a direct reference to Anubis around 3000 to 3500 BCE. But if you go back even farther, even 6000 years BC and before, there are loose associations between jackals and death. Oh. And I've thought about this and read about it. And so jackals were carrion animals that would just pick off of whatever they could find, mostly. And in the early days, before embalming practices were put into place and people were buried in tombs or in crypts or whatever, people were kind of just thrown into a shallow grave. And so it was very easy for jackals to just dig up bodies and eat them for sustenance. And so there's not obviously any evidence to this, but one thing I've thought about, just an idea or a thought, is it could have been an early way for people to appease this jackal. Don't dig up my dad and eat him. So this prayer, this reverence toward this creature, could have maybe been how this developed. This association between jackals and death, and how a figure such as Anubis. There are other jackal associated deities in Egypt than just Anubis, but it could have been how that began. I don't know.
And vultures too, right? I mean, wasn't there a similarity with some of the carrion that fly?
Yeah, there's a goddess now whose name has escaped me, starts with an N.
Nephthys, not Nephthys.
Nekbet or something, who is a goddess who is associated with vultures. I mean, there are many. There are so many deities in ancient Egypt, which part of what I was saying earlier with just the complexity in the history and the changing in leadership. And so you go to different points across Egypt in history, and you will see kind of sometimes contradictions, or you will see two deities that look very similar or almost identical, but they're different names in different places. And so it's very complicated, but yeah.
So, because Darren, I mean, I was thinking about the Book of the Dead too, because it supposedly goes way back to the early dynasties, and yet it talks about finding thousands and thousands of what was the quote I had here? Thousands of loaves of bread, thousands of vases of ale, thousands of linen garments, thousands of changes of wearing apparel, and thousands of oxen. So it was weird to me that that's such an early book in Egypt, and yet it was talking about the past, as in that there was thousands of these things. Like, and one of the things we talk about is the vases, thousands of vases that were found that were like it seems like they're very accurately made, like precisely made, that go way back further. So I feel like, yeah, like Darren's got a piece right there. But I feel like Anubis as one of the older ones. I mean, it could go back. I mean, they talked even about Atlantis having deities with human and animal hybrids kind of thing. It makes me think about some of that too.
Yeah, there are so many. It's interesting to look at specifically Egypt, and I don't know. There's so many different theories as to why they portray so many of their deities with animals. I mean, cultures around the world connect deities and animals in some way. Often it's a companion or a form that they can morph into or something. But it's a little interesting that it's specifically Egypt portrays their deities as being some kind of humanoid figure with features of an animal. That has always fascinated me, that it's specifically Egypt. I'm trying to, off the top of my head, don't know that I can think of really any other culture that does something similar to that. But to what you were saying about just the timeline again, it's really mind-blowing to think of how expansive, how long of a period of time ancient Egypt really spanned, because even by the days of Cleopatra, most major tombs had already been raided. All of the goods and the jewels and things had been long gone. So if historians, if archaeologists manage to find anything these days, it's kind of lucky, because so many of them are just empty.
Yeah. So what about, I wanted to ask you about, I got the sense from reading it, I don't know if you ever heard of the Monroe Institute, and so it's like an institute that trains you to go out of body and go into the astral realm, and they have a program that's called the Soul Rescue, I think. So they train people to go into that realm, and they find lost souls and make, basically make them recognize that they're lost, and they'll find their way home, or they'll move on through through that sort of bardo state, or that limbo. What's the word I'm thinking of?
Purgatory.
Well, yeah. I mean, maybe that's purgatory. I mean, that's why I'm so fascinated by Anubis trying to help people through. Like, maybe they knew that if you don't have assistance through there, you can get stuck in that limbo and just be, stuck in the state where you don't know if you're dead or alive. You're kind of in, like Darren said, maybe that's hell or purgatory, right? Just being stuck there.
Mm-hmm.
And And now here we have these modern, which isn't really accepted by science, but it will be eventually. But these modern programs that teach people how to go rescue souls. I mean, maybe that's what they were doing back then.
Yeah, that's definitely something I've thought of, and I honestly believe could have been entirely possible. There's a book that has since left the title has since left my memory, that talked about shamanic practices in ancient Egypt. And one thing that I think Anubis, there's a lot. So when I talk about death, it's not always a literal sense of the word, because there's a strong connection, metaphorical connection with death and transformation. And that's something that I work with Anubis a lot on, because I have had, I don't know how much you are interested in or know about astrology, but I have a lot of Scorpio in my chart. And so transformation and death are kind of a theme in my life. I've been through a lot of adverse experiences, and having someone to kind of guide you through that, I think, can be very beneficial. And so that's kind of the work I've done with Anubis. But there's a lot more talk about these sort of, I call it sort of shadow work, for your own purposes of sort of this soul retrieval and piecing together, fractured parts of yourself. But there's a lot more talk about it than there used to be, and I find that interesting. I keep seeing more and more and more of it kind of become a mainstream conversation.
The shadow work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what about the increased interest in just Wicca and paganism too? I mean, it seems like, mind you, there's also, I think there's an interest in Christ, not the church, but Christ as a non-denominational kind of thing, but which in some ways probably fits in with paganism and Wicca a little bit, the Christ consciousness aspect. So
yeah,
because you've been in this for a while, right? A couple of decades. Have you noticed a huge increase in interest
in that kind of thing?
Yeah, Wicca and paganism.
Oh, absolutely. It's interesting to me. I mean, when I was in high school, you could maybe find 2 books in the bookstore about that kind of thing. And now you go to pretty much any normal bookstore and can find a whole section on, they kind of lump it together with things like astrology and tarot that aren't necessarily towards one practice. But I don't know, there's just an increase in interest in it. And I have a lot of, I don't know. I think people are realizing slowly more and more that there's more to life than what they may have been told growing up. People, I think part of it is because of so many great teachers and authors have been able to share information that people have access to more, maybe in part due to technology, the rise of internet and social media, YouTube, things like that. People have access to this information that maybe they didn't used to.
Yeah.
And I think that's been a huge part of it, but it's interesting. Go ahead.
Do you think there's a need for like a warning, or to tell people to be careful? I mean, I feel like people playing around with this stuff with not realizing what they're actually doing. I feel like that's I'll talk to you more about that. We'll talk to you more about that later, but just in general, do you think people need to be careful and follow sort of an initiation type path?
I think I think you should approach things, people should approach things with curiosity, but also if you are brand new to something, especially if you're going to get into any kind of witchcraft or magical practices, working with any kind of deity or spirit, I think there needs to come up with a little bit of a warning label, because you don't know what kind of Pandora's box you're going to open.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at. Like personally, I kind of draw the line about making contact with anything, really, because how do you know? Like, and how do you do this? How do you ensure that you're making contact with Anubis and not something else, you know, like if you're opening some doors to communication, that to me is kind of scary in a way. I mean, I didn't
really
used to think
is.
that, but now I kind of do.
Yeah, you really have to be careful. I think that's why, you know, there's a lot of people who are solitary practitioners, but I think if you're going to learn this type of thing, you need to have some type of you,
Mentor.
you need to have something to guide you or someone to guide you. I guess, you know, there's a lot of great books and resources out there that could act as sort of a teacher, but I don't think it's quite a replacement for a person having someone in your life. That doesn't mean you have to join a group of people or be, you know, in a sort of group practice with this kind of thing. But I think that you do need someone there to kind of guide you, ask questions, answer questions, you know, kind of steer you in the right direction, so to speak.
What do you recommend yourself? Like, what do you do? Do you do protection spells for yourself, or
Yes. Nowadays, anytime I do any type of magical work or working, even communicating with this particular deity or spirit, I always have some type of protection. Either, I don't know, some type of stone or amulet or something. Often is some simple but quite effective. But especially if I'm kind of on the go and want to kind of, I don't know, meditate or communicate with a particular deity.
Do you well, like, what other deities do you communicate with?
Oh, Hecate is one of them. Freya. So here's one thing about me. I don't just work with Egyptian deities. I'm very eclectic in my practices. I've read a lot over the years, and some of it I have kind of absorbed into my own spiritual practices. Some of it maybe not, but I'm very eclectic in nature. So I don't ascribe to one particular path. I don't just work with one particular set of deities. I kind of see them all sort of as, you know, facets of maybe one particular energy, and can work with any number of them as I may want to. But Hecate, Freya, Anubis, I used to work a lot with Bastet, which obviously is also Egyptian, but the Morrigan sometimes.
how have you ever experienced anything else coming through besides what you're trying to make communication with?
I work with I do a lot of work with ancestors, and I have a particular ancestor of mine who likes to pop in at inconvenient times, sort of as a trickster, I suppose. But yeah, that's definitely happened. I don't know that I have any good stories to tell, but it's I don't want to say it's like commonplace, but it does happen. So.
I just speaking of ancestors and witchcraft, I was just reading a book called narrating a book called The Secret Commonwealth about the fairies, fauns, and elves from the 1600s. I guess it's one of the more popular kind of books about fairies and stuff going back to the Scottish Highlands. And I guess there was a witch burn. Like, apparently they didn't do as many witch burnings. They got away with paganism in the Scottish Highlands, I guess, a little bit easier than some of the rest of Europe and the lower parts of the UK. But there was a witch.
Being a witch, you're getting burning witches.
Like getting caught, getting burned, getting persecuted.
Scotland.
Yeah, they were little. It was. I don't want to get into the reasoning, but there was a witch named Dunlop, anyways, that got burnt there. Like, it was in that book. I'm like, I wonder if that's one of my ancestors. And
wow,
you know why I'm interested in this. So I want to go back and check. That's my last name. So
yeah, wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, I've always wondered. I don't have any proof of this, but if you go back in time, I mean, I know eventually if you go back far enough, ancestors, that's all they practiced because there wasn't Christianity, but that's going really far back.
Yeah,
but I always wondered if somewhere more modern, if I had an ancestor, just out of curiosity, that may have.
So what about, like, I do want to touch on, because I think you talk about this in your book a little bit, but one of the problems right now is, even when we talk about witchcraft, and like, even though there's a huge increase in interest in this, and especially working with somebody like Anubis, who's like, you know, the god of death. So then all these things like necromancy come together. Like black is one of the colors, obviously black and gold. So it comes across as evil probably to many people, right? Even witchcraft too. And I like how you address this in the book, and also, you know, how you talk about how it's not, these are just tools to use, right? It's not like these things are evil. They can be used for evil, of course, but it's not like, you know, whoever practices this stuff is evil. Like, can you sort of pair that apart a little bit?
You know, I think witchcraft kind of gets a bad rep from, in part, I think due to, well, okay, yeah, Christianity, but even more than that, I think also popular media has kind of gave it this bad rep, and I know it's kind of for entertainment purposes, but you know, you look at I don't know, a movie, for example, and with the witch is always the bad character, which I know it's a kind of a fantasy representation of it, but I don't know, I think in the back of people's minds, there's always this fear that they're getting into something that they shouldn't. But what I really think is important is to remember that it's just a tool, just as if you are a Christian or just a Christian, you go to a service, they have a certain number of things that they do. You may have like Catholics, for example, may have incense. They have, you know, the book that they're reading from. Those are tools. They aren't they're just the tools, just in the same that if you're doing witchcraft, the tools, the herbs, the stones, the candles, the energies that you're working with are just the tools. What you do with them is up to you. I mean, so that I think is important to remember. And you have to remember that witchcraft was always seen as such a negative thing because people wanted their voice to be louder. I mean, you know, they wanted their practices to be louder. And I mean, that's a little maybe harsh to say, but
what do you mean by that?
Well, I don't want to get into like any kind like religious debates or anything like that, but what I'm trying to say is that witchcraft, they were persecuted because I think people saw them as these powerful figures and intimidating figures, and so if I have to squash out these voices for my voice to be more powerful, then that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah. Because it's people taking power into their own hands. It seemed like, you know, that's what a lot of it is. Like, you know, people having the autonomy to alter, you know, their own reality, I guess. And it's okay.
Yeah, and that's exactly what witchcraft is it's using at least for me, the natural world. I do a lot of witchcraft that involves the natural world. So, you know, the elements, herbs and stones and crystals, and the elements and things. And for me, it's about empowering yourself and making your life or other people's lives better. Obviously, you can take that the other direction and do other things with it, but for me, that's what I choose to do.
Is that the definition of black magic, is using it against people then? Is that what you would consider dark magic or black magic?
Yeah, I don't know that I would call it that, but yeah, that's exactly, you know, you could call it dark magic, baneful magic, I guess, is another thing you could say. I don't know. For me, black is not a bad color. It's not a negative color. It's a color of protection and wholeness and strength more than anything. So I kind of shy away. I really shy away from saying black magic, white magic. I mean, I know you see a lot of fluffy witchcraft that uses that, but
I'm just going by like what they've said for thousands of years. They've called it black magic for thousands of years. So just like the common sort of name for it, you know. But I guess what I really mean is just evil, acting evil, you know, that kind of stuff. Because that can be subjective too, but I know that, you know, like some of the theosophists thought it was, I mean, I don't know, how do I say? I don't know. Let's see. There was some pretty bad definitions of black magic and evil magic. You know, anything like using your own will, even like kind of like very, which I would, you know, I have a hard time kind of going that far with it. You know, to me, it would be like harming others or using your power to harm others, or or that kind of thing, right? Would be a pretty easy definition for me, but not just like they had some pretty bad definitions in the 1800s.
Yeah. I can't say that I know a ton about the history of things, but definitely I think that there was a lot of exaggeration of what was considered to be evil or black magic.
Yeah.
It's unfortunately not something I know a ton about.
What about examples of Anubis in your life, like synchronicities or meeting, animal totems, that kind of stuff?
A story that I tell at the beginning of the book that I don't want to give too much away, but I have this is personal to me, and that's one thing that I do kind of explicitly say in the book is that my experience with Anubis or any deity is different than someone else's. And so what may be important to me, what may be a sign or a symbol for me that I associate with Anubis may not be what you commonly read in a book or that someone else experiences. But for me, one thing that I strongly associate with Anubis because of this story is coyotes. And obviously there aren't coyotes in Egypt. There never have been, or at least not the kind of common coyotes that we have here in North America. But every time I see one, it's kind of a rare thing to see them. But the last couple of years have had the chance to do some traveling around the state with my partner, and I keep running into them in the most random places that I wouldn't necessarily expect them to. And so that's just always a reminder kind of in the back of my head that that it's a connection to Anubis for me. But it's funny because for me anyway, deities like Hecate are very loud and in my face, and I get a lot of signs from her about it. Literal things like I've seen license plates that have part of the name Hecate in it or something, things like that. But Anubis is, for me anyway, more subtle, and I oftentimes have to get into more of a quiet space to have those kind of connective moments.
Yeah, that makes
which
sense.
I think is part of the message for me because I'm a highly anxious person and very much in my head. My brain is always going nonstop. And I think that's part of it is that learning to kind of be still, be quiet, and quiet my mind.
Yeah, that's good that you can see that and recognize it. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
And what about, honestly,
it's interesting that you'd equate the coyote with Anubis because in a lot of Indian cultures, it's
trickster.
Yeah, trickster or the creator itself. It kind of goes back and forth between those two roles.
Yeah. It definitely is kind of unconventional for me, but or for most people, but it's definitely something that's kind of a me thing.
Does Anubis not generally have the trickster element to him?
He seems like a straight shooter.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah. From my relationship with him, I guess if you could assign a sense of humor to him, it'd be kind of a dry, witty humor more than anything, but definitely not a trickster sort of being.
Plus, didn't you see a coyote actually like killing prey too at one point? That's pretty rare, right? To actually see it pounce and to actually get something. How rare is it to see that?
I know. I've seen videos of other like foxes, for example, which are more closely related to coyotes. You see them on like documentaries and they just do this little dive thing. I've never in my life seen. It's rare to see a coyote to begin with, but I was somewhere right along the coast here. I live in California, walking through this field, and I look off in the distance, and there's this coyote that just pounced right onto its prey. And it's the only time I've ever seen something like that.
There's a lot of coyotes around my place. It's crazy.
Yeah.
I see a lot of them.
You hear them howling at night too, or?
They're doing their roll call, and if there's not enough roll calls, then the females go into heat. They're like actively managing their population at all times. Yeah.
Interesting.
I hear them here, and I'm telling Maria, my girlfriend, I'm like, can't you hear the coyotes? And she's like, no, she just can't hear them. I'm like, I'm sure that I hear coyotes out there, but
Yeah, we have them here, but I live in a city, and so we don't get them here. But unrelated to this, but during the pandemic, people weren't going out, and so the mountain lions and coyotes were like sneaking into suburbs and
oh, really?
towns and things.
Getting a little closer.
Yeah, I mean nobody was out, so you know.
Interesting. Darren, do you got any
seem
questions?
to have evolved pretty well to live alongside the outskirts of human civilization. I mean, we managed to kill all the wolves, but we couldn't put a dent in the coyotes. If nothing else, there's more coyotes than ever.
Yeah.
There's something to be said. I mean, the Indians might have been onto something with that God stuff, you know?
Yeah.
Because even the bears, we managed to kick the shit out of the bears, but that coyote is just still there. Maybe it's the mosquito too. It could be the mosquito or the geese. The geese are also seen to be doing very well. But
geese survive on anger alone.
Yeah. The interesting thing about geese and ducks is that there's like they're one of those species that there's like thriving on human settlement. So they're like the wheat fields and the corn fields and everything else has them in greater numbers than they've ever been. I mean, it's quite a phenomenon to see those things flying across the sky. Well, yeah, I guess you kind of touched on a couple of these, but what are sort of the other what's because I guess right away I think of Hades and sort of is Hades from the Greek mythology. Yeah. So there's sort of these other figures, maybe not even deities, but figures that sort of play that role of Anubis throughout the different cultures. Is there any more? Like, I mean, the big ones to me are Death itself with the cloak and the sigh.
Yeah.
And then the Hades guy with the stuff on his eyes that takes you over the river. Is there any I'm missing, or because you must have stumbled across some of that in your research as well? Like you're sort of probably always looking for these different instances that could be Anubis, but in different words, right? Different languages.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that because even in Egypt, you come across multiple deities associated with death who all seem to be very similar. Like I was just saying earlier, you have Anubis, who was at some point seen as the Lord of Death, but then later, as beliefs changed, as important figures in kings, pharaohs decided this is what we're going to do now. Anubis's role kind of shifted in people's minds. That almost comes across as a contradiction, because you look at it, it's like, what, did he get demoted or something? Like, but then you have other deities in Egypt who are, so there's another deity by the name of Wepoet who is very similar to Anubis in some ways. And if you look historically, one of the, and now it's in my book, but I have forgotten which is which. One of them was worshipped in one part of Egypt, and then Anubis was in another part of Egypt. And so it's another one of those instances where it's like, is this just a different interpretation of the same thing? They have different names, but similar roles. They look similar. Is this just different interpretations of the same deity? So that's just even
the case. If that's the case, doesn't it like beg the question of what they're pulling from, that they could get different interpretations?
Yeah, and if you go beyond Egypt, there are canids, dogs, hounds, wolves, jackals of some kind associated with death. Like in you've got the hellhounds that followed Hecate around. I guess you could call them hellhounds, but there's culture somewhere in Central America. I can't remember, but there was a black dog that was associated with death, and I can't remember the name of it now. But anyway, there's death deities all over the world, and they're all different, but they're all I don't even want to say they're all similar, because they are all different. Because you look at Hades, and he's quite different than Anubis. Hades was someone who was often feared, and people would pray to him out of fear rather than sort of. From my personal experience and from a lot of people that I've talked to, see Anubis as more of a. That's not to say that he's he should be taken lightly, but he's more of this kind of gentle figure, more of a
Guide.
guide. Yeah. This, I don't want to say like a kind and caring figure, but he's more of a compassionate figure, and more understanding than than not. Again, that's not to say that he should be taken lightly, or that you just should not shouldn't approach him with respect, because obviously you should. But yeah,
I find it interesting. Like Darren, you mentioned Hades, and there's the Menta and Sheol. I mean, there's all these words for the where you go, like sort of a hellish environment upon death, and yet it's part of the initiation process as well. That you go in, you become resurrected like a new man, kind of. You can transform, like you said, and Anubis is transformation as well. So it reminds me of the death and resurrection thing as well, like not actually dying it, but maybe near death experiences or just spiritual transformations as well.
Yeah. There was a lot of time spent preparing, in ancient Egypt, I'm talking about, preparing people for the afterlife, in the sense that they could have a life in the afterlife. So the reason that they put so much thought and attention into it is that you had to preserve the body, so that you had a body to return to in the afterlife. Otherwise, your soul is just going to wander aimlessly and not have anywhere to go. And so the reason that they would fill tombs with, not just riches, but everyday things that you would have, they would literally put food into, at least in earlier days, put food into temples, or in tombs, so that when you re-entered your body, you would have sustenance. And so there was a lot of thought that went into how this would happen, and the process to, after you went through that whole journey that I was just talking about, in the afterlife and having your soul judged, then you could return to that and live a happy afterlife. They would paint these tombs with, at least for those that were rich enough to have a tomb like that, paint these tombs with depictions of kind of everyday things. And so they would paint these, you would have what would look like random figures, but they would literally paint servants on there who would take care of your cattle, and servants who were, cooking and doing whatever, so that, at least for, like I said, the people who are rich enough to be able to afford this kind of thing, when they woke in the afterlife, they had just kind of a regular life again.
Can you? Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that wasn't true for everyone, because obviously not everyone was rich enough to afford that kind of thing. So over time, I think that view shifted, because it used to be in the early days that really only the pharaoh or someone that was close to him, or an important figurehead, had that kind of experience in the afterlife. And so it really did shift over time to where pretty much anybody could get to the afterlife.
That's interesting. It reminds me of the soul rescue again, like looking back at your body and seeing it's still there, kind of would be like, oh, hey, that's me down there. I'm dead.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, what about your spell work and stuff? Like, can you talk about if you've had any experiences like making contact, or also maybe some of your favorite sort of spell work, something like that people could, like, if people are interested in making contact with this deity. I mean, your book has it all there, right? You've got sort of 2 parts. Maybe you can talk about your book and the 2 parts.
Yeah. So I wrote the book kind of as a way for someone who may not know anything about Anubis to be able to pick it up and have a starting point. So the first, I don't know if it's exactly half, but the first part of the book is more, well, there's a little bit of historical information combined with kind of talking about Anubis and his various roles. So it's more, information and facts. I talk about kind of each of his different roles and how that was connected to history, because I think that I think looking at history and also looking at myths can be informative. But another thing that I talk about in here is that it's informative, but also you have to kind of look at things from a modern perspective. So, but the reason that they are there is to kind of build that baseline knowledge of who is Anubis in the first place. The second half of the book, or second part of the book, is more a practical guide into how you can start building a relationship with him. And again, it's meant for anyone, no matter what path you're on. You don't have to be a witch or a pagan. Whatever path you're on, you can pick it up and start reaching out to him. So it kind of starts out with, how do I recognize when he might be calling to me, or I might be getting signs and messages? What does that look like? Then it's kind of building from there of, how can I communicate with him? What are some ways that I can do that? And kind of building from there, you can get into spell work. It's optional, I will say that. If you're not into witchcraft, if you're not into spell work, don't. You can have a relationship with a deity that is really just based on communicating with one another. It doesn't have to be spell work. And it goes even deeper than that. You kind of build from that. I talk about how you can do more meditative and journey work. You can build an altar or a shrine in your home of some kind if you want. And then kind of at the end point, if you really want to dedicate yourself to working with Anubis full time, I guess, or, long term, you can.
And shadow work too in there. Yeah.
Yes, there's a whole bit in there on shadow work, which is that's a whole conversation, a whole book in itself. But
yeah.
But again, any of this is, I say this about anything. I said this earlier about my own journey. Take what feels right to you out of it. It's not meant to be and I explicitly say this, that this is not the right or wrong way to do something. This is based on my experience and my relationship with Anubis and how I see Anubis. But if something does not work for you, and I'm saying you as in the reader, if this doesn't work for you, then do what does work for you, or try something else. Because at the end of the day, I don't, with that kind of warning that I had earlier, that you do kind of have to be careful when you're working with a deity. At the same time, I want to convey the message that Anubis, in particular, I'm talking about Anubis here, is more accessible than you might think. And the important thing is to, as long as you're being, I think, intentional and respectful, then it's maybe not as intimidating as you might think in this case. But anyway, you can go so much deeper than I have in the book with magical practices, with witchcraft if you're into that kind of thing, occult practices if you're into that kind of thing, that I don't even touch on here. But yeah, that's kind of the way that I laid out the book.
Charlie, this has been great. Where's the best place for people to get the book? I mean, it's only been out a couple weeks. Is there a website? Is there where's the best place?
You can I have all the links on, well, not all of them, but a lot of the links on my website, which is anubislightandshadow.com. But you can find it on any major bookseller. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million. You can buy it directly from the publisher, Wiser Books. I've even seen it on Walmart.com, weirdly enough.
That's
but
crazy.
yeah,
that's how far we've come now with this, right? It's in Walmart.
I guess so. Yeah, but anyway, I have on my website, anubislightandshadow.com, I've got links to social media if people want to follow me, or if you want to order the book, I've got links there. So yeah.
Awesome, man. Thanks. This has been fun.
Yeah. Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, good luck with the book.
Let us know when the new book comes out and we'll do it again.
Yeah.
I will. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, buddy.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
And that was a chat with Charlie Larson talking about Anubis, ancient Egypt's Lord of Death and Protection. What do you think? I mean, you've been reading all the Egypt books.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, I like it.
Anubis.
I mean, it's crazy because he does have a list of like all Anubis's titles and attributes, and it's pretty crazy, right? He's got himself into everything at one point there.
Dabbling in everything.
Yeah, that those deities
He's
dabbling.
like a catch-all deity.
Yeah, but no, it's good. I like it. I mean, it really reminded me of reading the obviously like the Book of the Dead, you know, because he's in there, and the weighing of the heart ceremony and all the questions that you're supposed, or all the statements that you're supposed to say in that. That's pretty fascinating.
It says in the chats that Anubis is the bastard son of Osiris.
Yeah.
So unwed love child, Anubis. There you have it. I was always wanted to get a ram head and do it as a Euro mount, because with the horns it kind of looks like Anubis.
I don't know about that. I think it looks more like Baphomet, probably. You better be careful with that one.
This is how I get the power.
Yeah, you're falling for it before I am.
Da, da, da.
Well, we have a Baphomet show coming up. Actually, it was delayed a couple months, and it is going to be fascinating. It's from Heather Lynn on the 26th. So 2 weeks from today is about Baphomet.
There you have it. Baphomet
revealed.
Anubis battling it out
Yeah.
in celebrity death match.
Yeah.
Big thanks to Charlie Larson for coming on the show. Big thanks to you guys for listening. Even bigger thanks if you're one of our nobles. And we bow to you if you're one of our lords or ladies. If you want to figure out how to do that, head over to Grimerica.ca/support today. Sign up for a monthly or make a one-time donation, and we would be forever grateful for it. And we'll read your note. We'll read your note if you want to send a note. And if you become a lord or lady, we'll just like do whatever you want, whenever you want. You just like call it up.
Should we put a price out there to become a deity? Or?
If you want to become a deity, it's 10 grand. Check.
That's what I had in my head too.
Money order. Or you could be a god of Grimerica. I mean, how great is that?
Pick out a name.
Nobody's a god yet, so you could be like,
pick out a name. Yeah.
Nobody's even really close. So Grimerica.ca/support. Sign up for a monthly. Whoops. Or I've just banged on my desk pretty hard. Or make a one-time donation today. Of course, while you're there, head over to Grimerica. Outlaw.ca for other podcasts. We got lots and lots, 300 episodes plus over there if you want to check that out. Adultbrain.ca for all those audiobooks. Contact at the cabin for the trips. There's some cool stuff out there now, some hunting stuff, and a great trip coming up with Randall. You want to sign up for that mailing list because the Azores Atlantis trip is coming. We got Nick. Shout out to Nick, who's over there now doing some amazing groundwork for us. So, I mean, it's going to be fabulous. It's going to be the ultimate Azores trip, I dare say. You know, I don't think there's anything else in the world quite like it.
Oh, yeah. No, it's going to be fresh.
Fresh. So fresh and so clean. So there you have it. I'll leave it at that. We love you guys. Thanks for listening. And we will see you next week.